Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those of you around the world. As Roger said, today I'm going to be talking to you about regulations. And the title of my presentation is focused on the global regulations. But unfortunately, as I was pulling the slides together, I realized very quickly that there's way too much information to cover in roughly 45 minutes to cover the globe. So I'm going to charge all of you, if you find this presentation helpful and interesting and you would like more content like this, you will receive an email after the presentation is over once the slides are available. Feel free to provide feedback to that if there's any additional topics that you would like more of the Asia Pacific region or maybe more sustainability topics, whatever would be interesting to you, so that PINFA can continue to tailor these webinars for the best interest of everybody. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive in. Go ahead and advance the slide. So the agenda, first of all, I'm just going to give a little background to get everybody on the same page. Then we'll switch gears. We'll talk about TSCA, the primary legislation here in the US, focused on regulating industrial chemicals, which is really, for the most part, where all of the flame retardants and plastic additives are used, not always. We'll touch a little bit on state legislation. State and current activities on the state level could take a whole nother webinar, so it's only going to be high level. And then we'll close with some updates to the EU regulations. Next, please. So let's just take a look at current market drivers. So if you're paying attention, which I'm sure everybody is, there's a lot of activity going around around the world focused on all things with clean energy, decarbonization, electronic vehicles, the infrastructure for the e-vehicles, eliminating PFAS, end of life, extended producer recyclability. All of these trends really fundamentally require innovation. If you listen to any of the speakers focusing on like our drives to net zero or any of those major initiatives for our climate, the one fundamental response that you hear when you ask about that is we currently don't have the technology available to fully support these drives to net zero. So with that, yes, we're going to require a lot of electronic infrastructure, but a lot of those are going to require new chemistries as well. So it's very important that we understand the regulatory landscape as we're going into all of these trends, because we're going to need to navigate all of these regulations in order to support these initiatives. Next slide. This is just a snapshot. You know, if for those of you who are involved with regulatory like myself, or who are involved with your companies and their regulatory partners, I'm sure you'll understand the message here on the screen is that the number of regulations in and around the world are just increasing. Just last year, the Biden administration had mentioned that within the EPA itself, they move further and faster than ever before. I don't have a count in terms of how many regulations they actually either proposed or finalized last year, but it was a huge number. And it wasn't just focused on TSCA, it was also air regulations, water regulations, the whole bit. A lot of these directly impact all of us that are on the call today. And if it's not us, it's our supply partners, either up, downstream. All of these will directly or indirectly impact our business. In addition to just chemical regulations, we have a large number of ESG regulations, or the sustainability, focused on, you know, CO2 emissions, maybe CO2 reporting, supply chain due diligence. There's a lot focused on that right now, and a lot of that is being driven probably mostly by the EU. And then, of course, PFAS. You know, if you're watching the news, probably every day there's some sort of PFAS, whether it's a bill at a state level, whether it's bans within certain companies. There's a lot going on with PFAS itself. Next slide. If we take just a snapshot at flame retardants, this is a timeline that shows how quickly and how many regulatory activities have been proposed or finalized in either banning or restricting certain flame retardants. And the takeaway from this slide is, if you look at the left-hand slide, that's 3 decades from 1990 to 2020. You know, yes, there's activity, but there's not a whole lot going on in 30 years. But then if you look at the right-hand portion of the slide from 2020 to current, there's about 10 to 15 major regulatory actions with regard to flame retardants that have just happened in that last few years. This just shows, it's pictorially a nice image to show, what's happening with flame retardants, but this is true with all of the chemical industry and the number of regulations that we're seeing to impact really our business. Again, flame retardants, but also plastic additives as a whole. Next slide. Okay, so let's get into some meat of this. So to get everybody on the same page, I know not everybody on this call is regulatory in their role. So if we take a look first at TSCA, TSCA is the primary regulation in the US, again, that's focused on regulating industrial chemicals. Basically, all of our companies need to comply with TSCA, no matter where we are in the supply chain, because it applies to not only the manufacturers or importers, but also the processors, users, and even those who handle the waste and disposal of the chemicals. So it really touches everything. TSCA was enacted back in the 70s and really went through no major changes until really in the last decade. Back in 2016, through bipartisan support, the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act was passed by the House and signed into law by President Obama. And that was the most significant and most major overhaul to TSCA since it was first put in place. A couple of the key things with the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act is that it was effective immediately, which really, if you were involved with TSCA and new chemicals at the time, you felt this as a company because EPA had to figure out from day one how to implement the new changes under TSCA. The other critical piece to that is that under the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act, the EPA had to change how it looked at chemicals. Before the EPA could establish whether a new chemical either may not pose or is unlikely to pose an unreasonable risk. So kind of that passive determination to more of an affirmative determination, whereby the EPA has to conclude that a substance will not pose an unreasonable risk to either human health or the environment. So you can imagine the burden on EPA to go from kind of that the gray area of not knowing to now that positive determination that something absolutely will not pose an unreasonable risk, not only for this use described in your application, like a new flame retardant, but for any reasonably foreseeable uses as well. So that really has put the burden on EPA to prove that something is safe beyond a reasonable doubt. In addition to that, the EPA was charged to start looking at existing chemicals. The one thing that you'll hear over and over again by NGOs and other groups is that, there's 80,000 chemicals that are in commerce right now, or over 80,000, and almost none of them have any safety information or whatnot on them. Well, that's not really a true statement to begin with, but some of the activities were really to identify, how many of those 80,000+ substances are really active in commerce. And from there, how many of those really are hazardous or are high hazard that really do need additional risk control measures for them. And so the bottom half of the slide really steps through the various exercises that EPA has done since 2016 to start addressing those existing chemicals and really start ensuring that they are safe for the intended use. Next slide, please. If we focus just on the new chemicals program within TSCA, this is probably one of the biggest challenges since the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act was passed. The statute under TSCA says that new chemicals should be reviewed and finalize the review within 90 days. Under Lautenberg, the statute gives the EPA additional 90 days. So technically they have 180 days to complete the review. What we are as industry is finding is that these reviews often take much longer than a year. I have 12 to 18+ months on there. That's probably realistic for the PMN, but there's often regulatory action that happens with these chemicals that will still extend that timeline even further. LVEs or low volumes exemptions, those by statute are supposed to take 30 days. Right now we're seeing that they take typically at least 6 months, probably 9 months is more realistic. So the challenge here is obviously how do you cope with that? If we're a company and we're trying to innovate, or you're a customer and you want that new chemical, these timelines really make it challenging because you have to plan and strategize well in advance. And you have to have uncertainty because you could see, the 12 to 18 plus months, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how that really takes. In addition with that, with the new TSCA and that new affirmative determination that I mentioned, what we're finding is that most chemistries that are going through the new chemicals process are being regulated by TSCA. Prior to the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act, we saw about 20% of chemistries being regulated. Since the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act has passed, we're seeing about 80% of chemicals being regulated. So this is a very significant change. They're typically regulated first with a consent order, followed by a SNR. And I have details on the following slides in terms of what that means. But the takeaway from this is, I know the mindset in the past is we don't want to deal with anything that's got a SNR because there's a burden, there's record keeping and things like that. However, in order to continue to support that innovation that we need to support those megatrends that I talked about, it's very likely that the new chemistries that are going to get approved are going to have regulatory restrictions or SNRs assigned to them. So we need to ensure that our mindset changes to that we can use these chemicals that are regulated. It just means that we need to follow the record keeping and controls that the EPA puts in place to make sure that our workers are protected, that the environment's protected, and downstream users are protected. Next slide. I mentioned the delays. This is a great snapshot from the American Chemistry Council. They started actually tracking how long things are taking. And if you look at the little meters on the left-hand side, this was from late July, the snapshot. But as of the time, there are only 48 PMNs that were actually still within that statutory timeline of the review. And then on the right-hand side of that dial, greater than 365 new chemical submissions were well beyond basically a year at that point. So it really was a nice illustration to support what industry was feeling in terms of how long these delays were really taking. The greater messaging from the slide too, the ACC had polled its own member companies to see, well, what is the impact for these delays? And you can see in the blue box, there's some takeaways there. I'm not going to read them all. But probably one of the most critical for our own economy is that 70% of the ACC member companies had decided to move the innovation that they're working on outside of the company. I'm sorry, outside of the country. So what's that mean? That means that it could impact jobs. It could impact our own supply chain. So if we're moving stuff overseas, it's not available to our own economy to support. And so, that's a big takeaway. And that's one of the major things that industry is trying to reconcile with the EPA to help them realize that even though they're trying to do all they can to make sure everything's safe, they're also becoming a big barrier to supporting some of their major goals and objectives around the electronic infrastructure and everything else that the Biden administration is trying to move forward. Next slide. As I mentioned, over 80% of the chemistries are typically receiving consent orders or SNRs, significant new use rules. The consent order, just to get everybody on the same page, that is an actual legally binding contract between the EPA and the actual submitting company of that new chemical submission. That only specifically regulates the company and the EPA. There's also record keeping that has to follow with that consent order so that the supply chain of that customer or that PMN submitter also adheres to those requirements. But that, again, that contract is just with that company. The SNR itself then is what is applied to the chemical substance as a whole. What's key with this is EPA is not only delayed in their new chemicals review, but they're very delayed, even more delayed with publishing the SNR. And in the next slide, I'll show you what that really means. But the SNR and it has to go through a proposed rulemaking with a finalized rulemaking to actually finalize and publish that SNR. And that could take years right now to actually publish once that PMN is done. The boxes on the screen just show the type of restrictions that we see with typical consent orders and SNRs, and some of the additional requirements like a 12B export notification. Again, this is just reference. You can, if you have any questions with this, feel free to put it in the chat box or the Q&A. Next slide. So again, just want to walk you through some of the challenges when a company receives a consent order and the fact that the EPA is very delayed in publishing a SNR. So again, only the signatory company is bound by the terms of the consent order. One of the things that is always in a consent order language, this is in their template, is that the consent order prohibits further distribution beyond a single distribution point. What that means is, my company is a ingredient supplier, if you will. If we submitted a PMN, we got a consent order, we could sell it to a customer who might be a formulator. That formulator cannot then further send that product, their formulated product, let's say it's a mixture at that point, to another customer for conversion, for example, until that SNR is signed. So there's a long period whereby, even though we have permission to use that new substance as a flame retardant or whatever, it really cannot be widely available on the market until that SNR is available, which again could take several years. Go ahead and advance. So I have two different scenarios here. This first one, scenario one, this would be like the example that I used. Huber is a manufacturer importer. We want to sell it to that formulator or processor. They can do anything they want with it as long as they follow the terms of that consent order. But they, again, are not permitted to sell it to a downstream user, where they might incorporate it into a paint or an article or what have you until that SNR is published. Alternatively, if you go to scenario two, if a company imports a material that's already part of a formulation, that formulation is, they're that submitting company. They're the ones subject to the consent order. They can directly sell into those end use applications because that's that first line of being able to sell. So the scenarios in these consent order, supply chain challenges are very important when considering if you have a new chemical that you want to notify with the EPA, you really need to think about your strategy to make sure you have the right supply chain partners in place to make sure that you can continue to sell your substance, and have it used how you want it used as soon as it's approved. And what that might mean is that formulator who, one of your supply partners actually participates in the PMN process with you, because they will also have to sign the consent order. And that means they can then sell to their direct user. So again, there's challenges that we need to work through, but they are manageable. Next slide. So switching gears to existing chemicals, back in 2021, EPA published 5 final rules on substances identified as PBTs, persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. I've highlighted on the screen here a couple that I know are used as either flame retardants or plastic additives, but I know too received a lot of attention because there was not a lot of participation from industry when the EPA first proposed these rules to actually effectively ban the chemicals. So when they published the final rules, excuse me, with the timelines in terms of when they should be phased out and whatnot, industry came forward and said, wait a minute, we're not ready for this. So EPA recognized that, and they worked with industry to actually have a broader timeline to really support being able to phase out in some of the applications. However, here we are in 2024, and basically most of these, or most applications, should not be using Deca-BDE or PIP-31 anymore. There are some extended phase out periods for Deca-BDE still for use in wire and cable and nuclear power. And EPA just, 2 days ago, I'm sorry, end of last month, just extended that timeline whereby they issued what's called a no enforcement notification, meaning that if companies are using the DECA BDE in wire and cable for nuclear power, if they can demonstrate that they're making solid attempts to reformulate and move away from the DECA BDE, there will be no enforcement penalties for them not meeting that deadline. If they don't demonstrate that they're trying to make a change, then they could be subject to it. So if you're in this market or, have customers in this market, this is just something to be aware of, because it's something that you want to educate them on. For PIP 3.1, basically the deadline is at the end of this month for any applications, except for there's a few exemptions that were still captured in the rule. And I have reference to the rule at the end of the presentation. Next slide. The other piece to existing chemicals that I mentioned at the very beginning was that the EPA really had to take a look and start going back and determining, of all the 80,000 chemicals on the market, how many are really high priority that need some sort of risk management to protect workers, the environment, the people, the public, no matter what. So EPA had to first establish a process. So what I have shown here is the risk evaluation process that the EPA established under Lautenberg, that walks you through their prioritization first, and then how they ultimately control the chemical in the end. If we take a look from left to right, the first step is prioritization. So EPA has to go through and determine what are their high priority substances that they look at. Right when Lautenberg was passed, they had to identify 20 high priority substances and 10 low priority. As a substance is going through and finalizes the risk evaluation, EPA needs to add another substance. So you can see it's kind of a slow process. They're doing 20 plus at a time. In the green, I have the timelines for each. It takes about 3.5 years to go from being identified as a high priority to actually finalizing that risk evaluation. So it's not a fast process by any means. Once the risk evaluation is completed and EPA has published that finalized rule, and again, for everything with the EPA, they have to go through a proposed rule and then a final rule. So everything needs to go through that regimented process, allowing for comment periods and whatnot. So it takes at least a year from the proposed rule to that final rule, pretty much. Once that risk evaluation is done, though, then it goes through risk management. And just recently, within the last year and a half, EPA has finalized risk management for several substances. I have those listed in red on the far right-hand side. Some of these may impact those of us on the phone, but probably more important are the chemicals that are finishing risk evaluation. There's several flame retardants on here, several phthalates. So these are, obviously used within plastic, or as flame retardants themselves. So this is something that if your company uses them, or somehow linked to them, pay attention, make sure you provide comments and feedback, because you don't want to end up where those PBT chemicals were, whereby EPA doesn't know your use and they're going to prohibit any uses beyond those that are already known. And then all of a sudden you're stuck. Next slide. This is kind of a deeper dive on the TCEP, because the EPA just finalized this one last month. Along with the finalization of the risk evaluation, EPA also published a SNR earlier this year for TCEP, as well as the two other flame retardants identified. What that means, and I mentioned this briefly on the slide before, again, is EPA finalizes risk management of these substances, whereby they either permit certain uses or they prohibit certain uses. Any use that's not described there will be prohibited, even if you're using it now. It's just because it's not captured in their risk management, you would have to go through the formal process of getting approval to use your substance for that use. So again, make sure you're paying attention if you're somehow linked to these substances, to make sure your use is identified. And, EPA understands if there's any challenges to reformulating, or maybe there's no alternatives for your specific use, make sure they're aware of that so that they don't ban it right away. For TCEP itself, EPA has determined several risks to both human health and the environment, both cancer effects as well as non-cancer, which is why they determine there's unreasonable risk. And there's certain conditions of use, if you will, that EPA looked at. And I have in the blue boxes those that are the higher risk. So those uses that I put in the blue boxes are those that EPA will likely target first. But what we're seeing too is that the EPA is kind of approaching these risk managements based on a whole chemical approach, meaning even though these roughly 10 uses altogether are the higher risk, it might be that EPA might just target the same actions like with the PBT substances and pretty much move to banning all uses. We'll have to see. Again, it's very important to get involved. So the next step with this is EPA has to go through that proposed risk management and finalize risk management. That process itself will take about 2 years total. So be on the lookout for the proposed risk management as your first step to provide comments. Next slide. Right now we do have a data call-in for the 16 substances that are shown on the slide here. The data call-in, EPA actually extended it, and the extended deadline is today. So if any of these substances have any interest to your company at all, make sure you have commentary, provided. You can, I included the docket number and the link at the bottom. But you could search on this online since the slides won't be available today. But make sure that you do provide comments and let EPA know if there's interest in any of these chemistries, especially if you know that it's challenging to either remove them or like vinyl chloride. Obviously, it's hard. It's a difficult substance to work with, but I will tell you, as I was reviewing all the comments, most of them are very, very negative against vinyl chloride because of the toxicity to that monomer itself. So I think if you are in the PVC business or somehow use vinyl chloride at all in your applications, make sure to provide comments so that EPA is aware of all the benefits to using PVC and other polymers used with vinyl chloride. Next slide. PFAS. So there's a lot of activity I mentioned with PFAS, but probably one of the most critical for our group is a PFAS reporting rule under TSCA. This rule was passed last year. The final rule was the reporting was supposed to happen this year, but EPA just extended that reporting requirement to be started in 2025. So July of 2025 is when it opens, and it will close in January of 2026. This is big. The PFAS reporting rule covers every substance that can meet this PFAS definition in the middle of the page. That includes PTFE, or really anything with a CF2 group will likely meet this definition. EPA estimates that there's roughly about 1,500 substances that they know of that fit in this definition. And what's key here is it's not just whether you manufacture or import the chemical, it's also whether you import any articles that contain PFAS. So this is only applicable to direct importers. So if you're buying from a distributor that imports, they're responsible for reporting. But if your company imports anything, and this could cover equipment, this could cover PPE, this could cover tape, I mean, anything, seals, gaskets, the whole bit, anything that could have a fluorinated material in it will likely be subject to reporting. So what's important here is just to do your due diligence. Make sure you're going through and asking your suppliers of anything that you import, whether they contain any PFAS that meets this definition, so you know whether or not you have to report, because that's going to be the next step when EPA does inspections and stuff like that, is show me what you've done to show that whether you have anything to report or not. So it's very important to make that paper trail. The other thing with the reporting requirement is R&D is only excluded if the R&D was less than 10 kilograms per year. And then this is key here, that R&D was not intended to be commercial. So that's really a tricky, sticky point for a lot of industrial companies, because most of us are doing R&D to hopefully target a commercial product. So, make sure you really understand that exclusion for R&D and see if your company did work with PFAS at a time, whether or not you have to report. I know there is a reduced reporting requirement for R&D, but if you do meet the definition where you're not excluded, then you will have to report on something. Next slide. It's just a snapshot of fees. One of the additional requirements under Lautenberg is that EPA has to collect at least 25% of its fees from the users. The box in red shows the current fees. So a current PMN costs $37,000 right now. Before Lautenberg was passed, for reference, the fee was only $2,500. So you can see that if you're wondering why costs are increasing with the supply chain, there's obviously a number of factors. One of them, though, is regulatory. The cost to comply with regulations and to innovate and introduce new chemicals is just getting higher for all of us. This fees rule was passed earlier this year, and EPA is supposed to assess every 3 years. So I'd imagine in another 2 years or so, we'll probably see another increase as well. Next slide. All right, so that was TSCA. So switching gears, let's take a quick look at the US states. Next slide. So this is just a snapshot of the actual states, the ones that are in darker blue that have active EPR legislation right now in 2024. EPR being extended producer responsibility. These laws, they're often focused on packaging and packaging materials and whatnot, but many of them have built into the laws bans. And the bans are often chemical bans, and they're often plastic additives and flame retardants. So if you go to the next slide, two maps here. The one on the left, those are all of the states that currently have bills that either passed or they're about to pass that are focused on plastic additives. So that's including flame retardants with that. So you can see there's a whole lot of states that have basically bans in place for these chemistries. The map on the right is focused just on flame retardants, and there's 16 states that actually have policies in place banning or restricted flame retardants. For all of these, I will say that most of those regulations and restrictions are focused on more consumer products. So a lot of them, children's products, toys, kids' mattresses, bedding. But some of the states have broadened it to be more, carpets and, furniture and household electronics and things like that, if you're making a flame retardant that you're selling in a wire and cable, sometimes you don't know whether that's being used for a TV or whether it's used for nuclear. You might for that. But at any rate, it's very important to understand and communicate with your supply chain too. If you're using something that's banned, which is pretty much the brominated flame retardants, that they understand where there's legislation that could prohibit end uses, like for use in a TV or something. Next slide. All right, so yeah, that was, like I said, just a snapshot for state activities. So switching gears and closing with the EU. Next slide. So I just want to get everybody on the same page. If you work with the EU at all, whether you have partners there, customers there, what have you, there's a lot of activity going on in the EU. And it's not just chemical regulations, it's sustainability, it's their targets for being carbon neutral. But to better understand that, I wanted to put this slide here, which shows the European Green Deal. This is really the driver for a lot of those activities that are coming out of the EU right now. There are, I think, over 150 different bills or legislation or proposals or whatever that are linked to this Green Deal. Not all chemicals or sustainability for that matter, but it just shows you the amount of activity that's going on. And really, if you feel like the EU and sales and opportunities in the EU becomes more and more challenging, it really is. And what you're feeling is really real because they are doing a lot. The goal of the EU Green Deal is really a response to COVID. They really wanted to pull the economy back up So a lot of this was to really rebound the economy. But the other thing that they saw is during COVID that the emissions of their country dropped, right? Because nobody was driving for the most part. And so they wanted to use that as a template and really their baseline to go, okay, well, how can we achieve these same drop in emissions as our economy comes to rebound? And that's why we have all those new laws in the EU around like carbon taxes and things like that. Next slide. But before the Green Deal came into the fact, we had REACH. So for those of you who, again, who work with the EU, you've probably heard of the EU REACH regulation, registration, evaluation, restriction of chemicals. That legislation was passed back in 2008, and they had a phase-in period whereby you had to register substances either based on your tonnage but volume. So registration started at 2010 and then it concluded by 2018. What that meant is that no longer did you have an inventory whereby if something was on the inventory, you could just market it freely. Instead, you had to register the substance yourself or make sure that your supply chain had registered it for you and they'll cover your volumes. So it really changed the burden in terms of complying with the European chemical regulations. Good and bad, the benefit to it is it's very much we'll say a checkbox exercise, and that if you do all the requirements, which costs a lot of money because it's a lot of testing, you pretty much can get approval for your substance. So you have you can estimate your timeline, it's predictable, you know when you can bring it to market. That can be advantageous compared to what we're feeling in the US, whereby, yes, the cost is lower. We don't have mandatory testing, but we don't know if things are going to take 12 months or 3 years. So in terms of strategy, sometimes the EU REACH regulation is advantageous in that way. But as part of that, ECHA wanted to take a look at all of their substances that are in high volume and figure out, okay, of those, what are high priority for Europe? And so back in 2018, they actually 2016, they rolled out this initiative for the integrated regulatory strategy. This is very similar to what EPA did with their prioritization in terms of high priority and low priority. But ECHA did this at a much faster pace. Next slide, please. If you look at the substances, these are all high volume substances and that they're registered at greater than 100 tons per year. And there's roughly about 6,000 substances total, excuse me, that met this 100 greater than 100 tons per year. I actually read an article this morning that said they actually just finished this prioritization. So the goal of this was to really look at what are our high priority substances, what are the low, of those that are high priority, what do we need from them? And what we typically need from them is some sort of regulatory action. And ECHA is really trying to group the chemistries, and you'll see that in the next slide, so that instead of going the one-by-one approach that we're seeing with the US, whereby it could take about 5 years to be designated as high priority to finally go through risk management, ECHA is looking at all the substances that are similar and trying to regulate them all at once. So next slide. So then that brings in the chemical strategy for sustainability. So as part of the Green Deal, this initiative under Europe was, and really specifically ECHA, was to look at the chemicals themselves and figure out how they can really eliminate harmful chemicals from their market. That's the goal of all this. So they really they focus on the boxes whereby they really are wanting to focus on the harmful chemicals first. They're looking at the cocktail effect, meaning, you know, what are the effects when chemicals are mixed together? Do they create some sort of additional negative, synergistic negative effect? They're also looking at how to support industry to actually drive innovation for safer and sustainable chemistries. So it's not just banning or restricting, but it's helping industry move towards the safer chemistry as well. Next slide. One of the proposals under the chemical strategy for sustainability is to actually revise the REACH regulation. There's several facets to this. I'm not going to touch on all of them, but if you look at bullet point number 1, this is where ECHA is proposing to actually revise the registration requirements for substances. What this means, first of all, is ECHA has just incorporated the endocrine disruptor as one of its endpoints. So they'll want companies to go back and assess whether a substance is an endocrine disruptor or not. The other thing that they're going to likely ask for is more data, especially on those lower tonnage band substances, in addition to having a registration requirement for polymers. All of this, I've seen like draft legislation in terms of what all this means and stuff, but until things are going through a final rulemaking, we won't know what that really means to industry. But especially for polymers, because that's pretty much relevant for all of us, it's likely that if a substance meets a polymer of low concern here in the US, that it should meet a polymer of low concern in Europe, and not require registration, or maybe require a reduced registration. If a polymer is not a polymer of low concern in the US, whereby it would meet the polymer exemption requirements, then it likely will have to go through a full registration with the EU. So, again, this is just proposed right now. Now that all the elections and stuff have happened, now they're just waiting for final rulemaking in terms of timing and what that means. So we estimate in the next couple of years we'll see more on this. The other bullet point I want to call your attention to is number 4 here, whereby ECHA wants to actually start using that IRS, the integrated risk strategy, and the prioritization that they did for their chemistries, and really start, if you will, banning, regulating the groups of substances that they identified as the higher risk. And then from that piece, they actually introduce what's called the essential use concept, which I have on another slide. Next slide, please. So for the restrictions and roadmap, these I've captured. They have probably about 20 to 30 different groups of chemistries that they've looked at. And if you go through the restrictions roadmap, they have great summaries that go through and identify the chemistries, and then each one that would fit in that category, as well as the hazards that they know about it, as well as any additional information they know about it. So they really have done extensive research on all of these chemistries for just the proposal for the restrictions roadmap. One of the key ones that came out of this is a roadmap for flame retardants themselves, and they've broken it up into several different categories. Right now, ECHA's prioritized in the aromatic brominated flame retardants. They've actually asked for industry input, which we provided back in June. They asked for, whether there's alternatives or whatnot. The next step will be aliphatic brominated flame retardants, and then they also are looking at the organophosphorus flame retardants. In addition to that, I've captured several different materials that are used in plastic or plastic additives. So if any of these are of interest to your company, I have a link there and you can do a deeper dive. Again, these are just roadmaps. They're not restrictions or anything by now, but it kind of gives you that insight in terms of where ECHA is probably going. Next slide. Essential use. This is where ECHA wants to, again, they want to eliminate the hazardous chemicals from their market. So the essential use is whether the substances that are classified by any of those endpoints that I have on there, basically CMRs or PBTs or whatnot, whereby the substance itself would be considered essential if, number one, it's critical for the functioning of society or for health and safety. So how do you define critical for functioning of society? That's a challenge. The other piece to that is there are no acceptable alternatives. So both of those criteria have to be met for essential use. Again, this is just a proposed concept and we don't have the legislation behind it. But this is something that we'll probably see in the next few years for this being developed into legislation, and so that ECHA can start actually removing those substances from the market that are more hazardous. Next slide. And just final notes, as I mentioned from the very beginning, there's a lot going on regulatory wise, and I still only touched on the US as well as the EU. Didn't even touch on the globe, really only highly touched on sustainability, which is really intertwined with a lot of these chemical regulatory requirements. But, if you feel like you're feeling a lot of pressure, you are. If you look at my little balancing act, there's a lot of technical needs for all the products that we're offering. Um, you know, Not only that, we have to minimize costs. So, we got fire safety, we need to manage the product performance as well as cost. But at the same time, we've got chemicals being banned or restricted. We've got goals or laws whereby we have to reduce or eliminate CO2. And maybe we're being taxed on that if you're in the EU. There's also recyclability laws whereby, some, especially the extended producer responsibility, have mandatory recycling content and whatnot. But that's leading to other challenges because now we're finding there's articles whereby they're finding residual flame retardants show up in children's toys because they use recycled plastic. So it's a very big challenge to kind of do it all. And on top of that, you've got your changing market trends, you've got your supply chain security. Of course, we're eliminating PFAS. So if we're just talking 1,500 substances there and we got to find alternatives, all those alternatives likely need to go through a regulatory action of some kind to get approved. So the takeaway here is it's not getting any easier. And if you're feeling like it's challenging, it is. So just welcome it, embrace it, and rely on experts like myself or your colleagues, because we're all in this together. And I think in the end, we all want to do better and offer products that are safer and more environmentally friendly to support the growing trends of our country and our globe. And I think that's all I have. Next slide. This is just an agenda, a list of acronyms and whatnot if you want to reference later. Next slide. And that's it. So thank you very much for participating today. I really appreciate you calling in. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take the rest of the time to answer them.